Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Winfrey, and I'm trying something a little bit different for this particular program. This is going to be something that is influenced by a favorite podcast of mine, Hardcore History. So if you're familiar with that program, you might understand a little bit of the style I'm going for here. Hopefully, it'll be successful. Now, if you've read the title of this particular podcast, then you know I'm going to be talking about professional wrestling a little bit. I don't podcast about wrestling all that often. In fact, very, very infrequently. But I do cover it and have for several years now for 411mania.com if you're curious. And my fandom with professional wrestling has been up and down over the years. I adopted what I like to think is a slightly healthier attitude towards it. When it stopped being entertaining, especially consistently being unentertaining, I simply stopped watching it. That seemed like a much better use of my time. Now, I do that to a little bit establish my bona fides here, that when I say what I'm about to say, I am not condescending to any of you. I am not trying to insult you. But it's somewhat important that we establish the following as something of a parameter for why I want to talk about what I want to talk about. That being the reality that professional wrestling is frequently, in fact, I would argue most of the time, pretty dumb. Simulated combat, it's weird costumes, it's most of the time very, very simplistic narratives. It's a combination of physicality and acting, with neither one necessarily rising to the fore of any given performer. They're very talented individuals. I don't mean to imply otherwise, but none of them are truly great gymnasts, otherwise they'd be gymnasts, and they're not truly great actors, otherwise they'd be actors. And you get kind of a amalgamation of those people into professional wrestling. Most of the promos are delivered with a truly baffling pace that is clearly designed to make room for a laugh track. Now, it's not a laugh track because there's a live audience, but this was made painfully clear, especially during the pandemic, when there was no audience for whom the wrestlers had to pause, and yet they did anyway. If you've ever seen some of the fan edits of a conventional sitcom where the laugh track is edited out, you'll understand a little bit what was going on there. Now, professional wrestling being dumb does not mean you should feel bad for liking it. That's fine. I do. And there might be different promotions and different styles, and it's a fairly wide-ranging genre. This is okay, but I wanted to establish that it's not. It's a little bit dumb because when something truly harmonizes, when all the relevant story elements, personalities, physicality all coalesces into just the right alchemical mixture, it is a unique form of magic. And I think we're witnessing one of those moments right now. Now, you can find some of these moments throughout wrestling history all across the world. Maybe you're a little bit older school, so something like the Macho Man Randy Savage reuniting with Miss Elizabeth and him holding the ropes open for her after losing his retirement match to the Ultimate Warrior. This brought grown men to tears, and I understand why. Maybe it was watching Kofi Kingston's brief but very, very undeniably called for ascension to the title picture at WrestleMania a few years back. Maybe it was watching Bryan Danielson, then going by Daniel Bryan. I'm going to reference a few different wrestlers who have gone by different monikers over the years. I'm going to generally default to whatever they're going by now, wherever they happen to be, simply for the sake of ease of conversation. But his run to winning the World Championship at WrestleMania 30, there's any number of these things. In fact, if you're a fan of Japanese style professional wrestling, especially all Japan in, say, the 90s, the saga of Toshiaki Kawada and Mitsuharu Misawa is the stuff of legend. Even if you go back and rewatch it, you can still feel it. It's some truly great stuff. And we're dealing with a story that I think is going to wind up in those particular annals. By the way, if you have others that I didn't mention, feel free to be aware of them, or if you're watching this on, or listening to this on some kind of a platform that allows comments, feel free to leave one. But watching the Royal Rumble in this year, 2023, the finale of it cemented in my mind that what we're watching at the moment is one of those rare moments when the silliness of professional wrestling falls away, and what we're left with is a truly compelling narrative delivered as only this particular genre can deliver. And that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about Roman Reigns, the most compelling character professional wrestling has produced in the last handful of years. And I want to talk about his run and the man who will, in all probability, I am recording this prior to WrestleMania, will in all probability dethrone him, Cody Rhodes. And the intersection, and why, in point of fact, Cody Rhodes is the right man to finally slay the dragon that is Roman Reigns. See, at the Royal Rumble, your main event, the final match of the evening, was a match for the two titles held by Roman Reigns, the WWE Universal title and the WWE Heavyweight Championship. He is somewhat colloquially known as the undisputed WWE Universal Heavyweight Champion. And you can make all the ooh-woo jokes you like. I have in the past. They amuse me. But Roman has held these titles for the conglomeration of them for almost a year. He unified the belts at last year's WrestleMania. The Universal title in particular, he's been holding since August 30th of 2020. This marks perhaps one of the longest reigns of the modern era, like the longest reign of the modern era by a non-trivial margin, as he has crested the 900-day mark, holding one of the major championships in the organization. And he was defending these against Kevin Owens, an on-again, off-again rival of his, but they'd been separated for quite some time, and Owens stepped up, wanted another shot. Roman won in relatively predictable fashion. The match itself was fine. But what really stands out was what happened after the match. Owens, who had been poking the bear of Roman Reigns, I'm going to talk about Roman in just a minute to set this up better, but is the subject of a beatdown by not only Roman, but his cadre, his lackeys. They call themselves the Bloodline. These are his cousins, the Usos, Jimmy and Jay, and recently main roster debutant Solo Sikoa. And in the crossfire of this is want to be member of the Bloodline, Sami Zayn. Sami's quest to join the Bloodline had garnered a ridiculous amount of connection with the audience. And Sami Zayn's relationship with Kevin Owens is the stuff of legend if you followed their careers. These two not only came up together as young wrestlers, they have been tag team partners and bitter rivals, on again and off again, throughout their entire wrestling careers across any number of promotions. From Pro Wrestling Guerrilla to Combat Zone Wrestling to Ring of Honor, back when Ring of Honor was actually irrelevant as an independent promotion, to NXT, the WWE's developmental promotion, to on again, off again, even once they debuted on the main roster for WWE. And their relationship is complicated again. They have been best of friends, they've been bitterest of enemies, as pro wrestling is wont to do with its various participants. And Roman is prepared to end the problem and the nuisance that is Kevin Owens. Owens is handcuffed in the ropes, he is helpless, and Roman is preparing to brain him with a steel chair. Sami stops him. He pleads for his friend, not in a please don't hurt my friend kind of way, but in a this is beneath you, Roman. And Roman agrees. He then hands Sami the chair, tells him to do it, and Sami winds up hitting Roman in the back. And the eruption from that crowd at the Royal Rumble was the likes of which you hear so infrequently. It was a singular moment. a moment that solidified to me how special what's going on is. And it somewhat inspired me to do this. Now, that match, that interaction led to a title match for Sami Zayn at Elimination Chamber a month or so later. Right, the machinery has to keep turning over after all. It was in Sami's hometown, and there was a bit of a push from the fan base to see Sami dethrone the monster of Roman Reigns. And I want to talk about why I think it was the right decision to have Roman retain. It's not a knock on Sami Zayn, but rather an understanding of what's going on at the moment. And to fully understand this, we have to talk about the narrative of professional wrestling, the participants, and a little bit of the backstage stuff. So that's what we're going to cover going forward here. Roman Reigns has been the undisputed king of professional wrestling, certainly the WWE, for at least 2 years, if not a little bit longer. Now, Sammy's title shot, he had the weight of the fans behind him. They wanted it, they had glommed onto him. But I think it's important to understand you can't simply beat someone like Roman with. You need a narrative to beat him, right? Because this is a narrative business. And you need to bring something more to bear than just raw popularity, which Sammy certainly had. Frankly, if we were under a different set of circumstances, a Sami Zayn win at Elimination Chamber might have been entirely appropriate. If Roman's dominance was the kind that permitted the occasional win by another challenger, he would regain it in short order, but occasionally dropping the belt. It might have been appropriate, but that's not what Roman's been doing. He has been a monolith since his return. He's had a death grip on the Universal title. He returned. Let's talk about Sammy very briefly, actually, before we talk about Roman. Why did people start attaching themselves to Sami Zayn? I think some people can see themselves in Sammy in some very real ways, and we needn't look no further to understand what's going on with Sami Zayn than last year's WrestleMania. Last year's WrestleMania saw Roman Reigns triumphantly unify his Universal title with the WWE title. At that time, it was held by Brock Lesnar. Those two have had an intermittent rivalry, given some of the schedules that both men have kept over the years. They haven't always been butting heads, but they'd had their share of interactions, and Roman finally putting down Brock Lesnar and unifying the titles. One of the finer moments of his career, standing astride the world, the universe of the WWE. Well, do you happen to remember what Sami Zayn was doing at that particular WrestleMania? Because I do. He was losing a prop-filled comedy match to Johnny Knoxville and the Jackass crew. Looking at that match and the build to it, you would never, in a million years, imagine that a handful of months later, he would be one of the most celebrated figures in the business. And that as we closed in on WrestleMania, he was the one that people started thinking should be the one to dethrone Roman Reigns. Just it wouldn't necessarily have computed. But there we were. Sammy had a career low. We're talking purely about the narrative here, losing to a celebrity, a frankly over the hill physical celebrity. And before that, he had spent most of the previous year discussing himself being the victim of a conspiracy. He was alone. His friendship with Kevin Owens had turned into they'd recently had another run-in physical over Owens believing that Sami Zayn needed help and needed to stop with this conspiracy theory nonsense. Sammy's other kind of charges prior to that, he had been loosely affiliated with a group. Uh, Claudio Castagnoli, then going by Cesaro, as well as Shinsuke Nakamura, a few others. And these people were no longer around him. His best friend had very recently beaten the crap out of him. He was alone. He had lost his Intercontinental Championship. And like so many, especially men, lonely, isolated, disillusioned, began to think the world was after him. He began to see conspiracies everywhere. He became a little bit unhinged. He became obsessed with his reputation. He began calling himself the locker room leader. This was played for comedy. And then to lose to Johnny Knoxville at WrestleMania, it's hard to get much lower than that in the story. Backstage, his match and his performance were well received, and that's kind of why he was put in the position that he was put into. But narratively, Sami Zayn now sees, from his lowest point, perhaps he should attach himself to the highest point. There is no higher point in WWE than Roman Reigns. So he begins attempting to associate himself with the bloodline. He wants to be one of them. He wants to be helpful. He needs a sense of belonging and a sense of community. And again, this is something that happens all over the world, all the time, in some cases especially to younger men. They are alone, isolated, feeling disillusioned with reality, and it makes them vulnerable to some of the predations of someone like Roman Reigns. And Sammy would spend months trying to ingratiate himself. He slowly becomes favored by members of the bloodline, not Jey Uso, but we'll get to Jey. And taking shot after shot that was aimed at members of the bloodline and helping them prevail, culminating in him taking out Kevin Owens in a War Games match to facilitate the win for the bloodline over our valiant babyfaces, the good guys. And this all, unfortunately, as Jey Uso finally embraces Sammy as his brother and one of the bloodline, Roman starts to become hesitant. He decides that this final test for Sami Zayn will be this Royal Rumble match, where we'll see what happens when he fights Kevin Owens. And Sammy, of course, is not going to take the abuse of Roman and turns on them and pays the physical price. And this is all well and good. But the story of Sammy realizing the abusive relationship that Roman is foisting on him and everyone else in the bloodline, his reward is not dethroning Roman. His reward is his freedom and his willingness to fight and the opportunity to oppose the evil, but it is not to overthrow it. It's not usually how those stories go. And what you need to beat Roman Reigns is what we're going to talk about here. Because, again, you need some kind of narrative behind you. You can't just be better than him physically. This isn't real combat. You can't just be more popular than him, though that certainly helps. There has to be something more to it. And to understand what you need to beat Roman Reigns, we have to flash back a little bit here. Roman Reigns returned from a brief hiatus in August of 2020. He has on again, off again battled leukemia throughout his life. In fact, he was a champion at one point, had to relinquish that title as his leukemia had come back. He was able to battle it off, return to action, then COVID. And as an immunocompromised individual, Roman took more time off until he was certain that he could return to work safely. Very reasonable move on his part. His life is certainly more important than anything related to professional wrestling. But when he returned, Roman was nothing like his previous versions. He was no longer a sort of hapless, almost happy to be there, hard luck case. He came back with a character, a version of himself, less to do with anything from professional wrestling and more akin to Daniel Day-Lewis's character of William Cutting, Bill the Butcher from Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York. a physically ferocious, intelligent, manipulative, quiet, menacing, terrifying presence that has ruled, I can't say unopposed, but never successfully challenged ever since. There was, however, a moment for this new version of Roman, and it's one I think we need to talk about very briefly because it plays into what happened at the Royal Rumble. One of Roman's first feuds after claiming the Universal title was with his cousin Jey Uso. Jey is one half of a tag team known as the Usos with his twin brother Jimmy. Jimmy was injured at the time, and Roman decided he wanted to work with his cousin, and Jey was a suitable challenger for SmackDown, which is what the brand that housed Roman at the time. And Jey's narrative here was an interesting one. He wanted validation. He, in a very passionate promo at one point, said, "Do you know the most frequent question I'm asked? It's which one are you?" Because again, he and his brother are twins. He objected to Roman's behavior, and Roman wanted his blood by his side. He wanted to build more than just himself, granted for himself, but not just himself. And his family member was first on his list. Please join me, fall in line, and I can give you what you claim you want. Jey resisted. They fought a few times, and the relevant match here was a Hell in a Cell match, which is a theoretically very brutal kind of match. If you're familiar with professional wrestling, you'll understand. If not, it's difficult to fully explain what that kind of match is supposed to mean. Because it's not just a match in a cage. It's meant to be the special ender of issues within the world of WWE. This is the final, brutal, bloody, hellacious stamp on an issue, on a feud. And for a while the concept was diluted, but that's a whole different discussion. But it did somewhat fit here, even if it was abbreviated. They'd only had one match prior to this. But something about the narrative here did call for a Hell in a Cell match. And not just a Hell in a Cell match, but with an I quit stipulation. The only way to win being to make your opponent say, "I quit." Now, the match itself it wasn't completely one-sided, but it did heavily favor Roman. But Jey Uso would not acquiesce. He would not quit. It didn't matter what Roman did to him. And finally, Roman, frustrated by all of this, grabs the ring steps. Very large, and they're made of metal. It's partially metal. And he hoists them above his head and prepares to crush the skull of his cousin. And there'd been some reason for the cage door to be open for the structure. And Jimmy Uso runs down and begins pleading with Roman, "Don't do this. We can figure this out. There's a better way. He's not going to quit. Please, why are you doing this?" And understand where we are at the moment here, because this is important for what happens next. This is meant to be hell. And that's where Roman is. He is somewhat freshly into his return. He is now engaged in a bitter physical fight with his family member, who will not acquiesce. And he puts down the steps and he winds up sinking down, and for one moment we see a little bit of, perhaps you could consider it, the old Roman. He, almost in tears, looks at his hands and to his family member says, "I don't even know who I am anymore." And Jimmy begins begging him, "It's okay, we're family, we can still figure this out. It doesn't have to go this way." This is a moment. The kind of moment that some of the best villains across all of media have. Your last chance. Last might be a bit of a stretch, but certainly, you're dramatically speaking, your last chance. Not every great villain, but a shockingly high number of them have these moments wherein they can save themselves. Maybe not, they cannot avoid consequence. but they can save who they are. And again, this is replete throughout various forms of media, perhaps the most famous one being Macbeth in the Shakespearean play of the same name. In Act 3, Scene 4, he has the famous quote as part of one of the few soliloquies, not monologues, from that character. Macbeth is actually a relatively opaque character in the Shakespearean pantheon. But he says, quote, I am in blood stepped in so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as to go on. Close quote. This is a famous sentiment. Macbeth has done horrible things to this point. He has set himself up as king. He has violently murdered not only some of his rivals, but their families. He has killed the family of his principal opponent, Macduff, who is the one who will come back and provide vengeance. And we're in Act 3, this three-act play, so we are near the end here. And the Mad King looks around himself and decides, I've come so far, it no longer matters if I keep going forward or backward, and he resolves to continue on. Now, of course, this is only partially true. Could Macbeth have saved himself at this point? Well, no. Events are in place that will lead to his death. But he might have been able to save his soul. He might have been able to reclaim a bit of the good man he used to be. And he rejects that, as most people in this situation do, rejecting anything beyond the physical. Sometimes it's just bad justification for what you've already done and trying to make sense of it. Anakin Skywalker in the prequel trilogy has a similar moment in Episode 3. This is Revenge of the Sith. Not when he might have allowed Mace Windu to execute Emperor Palpatine, but rather on Mustafar right before his fight with Obi-Wan Kenobi that leaves him missing his limbs and on fire. When his pregnant wife begs him to stop going down the path that he is on. Anakin Skywalker at this point has already slaughtered children. There are consequences here, inevitable consequences, but he could have turned back. He does not, of course. He is now too steeped in his own self-loathing and trauma to fully recognize this. In fact, he will not recognize the choice that he should have made until many, many years later when he saves his son from being violently tortured and murdered by the Emperor. But he could have turned back and saved his soul at that point. You can argue whether or not he did in the end. I suppose that's the debate about how one finds redemption in death after a significant period of time of atrocity is a long-standing debate in the circles of literature, and I leave you to make your own conclusions about that. There's another example that might be more apropos for our setting here. Not just the Mad King in his castle stewing on his actions, not the powerful but slightly unhinged and desperate fallen champion. We are in hell here with Roman Reigns and his family as he considers his future, wondering who he is. The character I'm going to invoke here is one that might carry a degree of infamy with certain people, and if you don't, then I promise not to explain too much. But in the epic dark fantasy manga series Berserk, one of our characters, a very integral character in fact, by the name of Griffith, finds himself in hell, as close as we're going to get to it for the majority of that particular story, at an event referred to as the eclipse, because appropriately enough there is an eclipse, but it transports him and people around him into a very well-realized vision of hell. And here, Griffith, who has been the subject of a year's worth of physical and psychological torture, is presented with an option by supremely powerful beings. You can resume your quest. Griffith, in this setting, has always had a goal to formulate his own kingdom. He is a commoner, born dirt common, who through his own tactical genius has formed a mercenary band, had begun currying favor with powerful nobles, an undefeated reputation on the battlefield, had begun gaining favor with the king himself, and it all fell apart for him. And for reasons that are not necessarily in the purview of this particular discussion at the moment, but he finds himself here at the lowest point one can imagine. For the last year, he has been, again, tortured. He has had skin removed, the tendons in his arms and legs have been severed. He cannot reliably grip things or stand on his own. He has no tongue. But if you're torturing purely in a punitive sense instead of for information, then you don't really need a tongue, do you? And he is shown a vision of himself as a young boy running towards a castle, his kingdom. And as he continues running, he starts to realize he is not running on streets, not the familiar back alley cobblestones of the city of his youth, but rather on the piles and piles of bodies that he has left in his wake to this point. Some of them his own men fallen in his service, some of them the countless enemies that have fallen before them, and he stands atop this pile of corpses, still not yet reaching his goal. And he's told, this is your choice. You can choose not to offer up the remaining people around you. You can choose to stop this. You can go back and live the rest of your life as you currently are. Griffith very recently had something of a hallucination or a vision of what that life would be like. A life of utter mundanity and a life of peace and, again, averageness that others might, in this very grim world of Berserk, would kill for. And he is disgusted by it. He's told you can choose. And if you are shattered beyond all recognition, then go back. Live your life. But if that castle on the hill gleams as brightly now as it ever did in your eyes, you know what you have to do. Pile them up. And Griffith decides all these people are dead anyway. There's no point in repenting, because it won't change anything. And he makes his choice. And this is similar to where we find Roman. Roman Reigns, sitting on the mat, his opponent, his cousin, more or less unconscious before him, and the still injured, I believe his arm was in a sling, Jimmy Uso, begging him to stop. Roman could have stopped. He does not. He makes his choice as well. He puts Jimmy Uso in a guillotine choke and proceeds to strangle nearly the life from him. Jay, who would endure any amount of physical abuse on his own behalf, quits to save his brother. Jay falls in line with Roman's vision for him and the family. Jay is in fact rewarded. It's the nature of characters like the one Roman is currently portraying. They will in fact give you what you claim you need, what you want, at the expense of all else, at the expense of anything that challenges the king, the chief. No one asks which one is Jey Uso anymore. Not just because he and Jimmy have different haircuts. Jay went from being an interchangeable part in a tag team that, while successful, had never, very rarely at least, garnered serious momentum, to being the right hand of the king of the WWE Universe. He got what he thought he needed, and nothing more. This is what people like this do. This is the moment that Roman sought to replicate with Sami at the Royal Rumble. Your theoretical hero, presented with the option to turn back. Become the bloodline, and you will get your found family. You will get belonging. You will be part of The most dominant force in this promotion, arguably in all of professional wrestling, and all it will cost you is what makes you you. And Sammy, holding a chair, has to consider this. Roman expects Sammy to do what he did, because villains like this always expect people to do like they did. They expect the cold, calculating reality. And they neglect to consider the people for whom more than that is required. Macbeth, Anakin, Griffith, pick your poison. There's many other examples. They rely on a justification that all that matters is what we can tally in a ledger. And they lose something so much more important. Roman had a chance. I'll return to that moment, by the way, that moment inside Hell in a Cell again later. And he chose. Why he chose, we'll get to, but he chose. He expects Sammy to make the same choice. There is no upside to Sammy denying this. Sammy is surrounded by violent men who will not look favorably upon his actions. In fact, they did not. Sammy will be cast out from a dominant faction that has seen him rise in popularity. He will be shunted back down the card, in theory, at least to Roman's way of thinking. He brought him and helped elevate him from a comedy prop match to a man whose actions hold the sway of millions of people. Why would he throw that away? Well, the answer is because Sammy was not willing to give up his soul. He was not willing to give up the bit of himself that mattered. Hard to find a more poetic way to put it than that line from V for Vendetta, be that the graphic novel or the film adaptation. The last inch of himself. That last bit that he will not allow to be crushed. And Sammy got close to beating Roman. But Sammy's reward was not to dethrone Roman. Sammy's reward was saving his soul. Which, frankly, is worth infinitely more than the leather and metal belts that Roman carries around. But what do you need, then, to defeat someone like Roman Reigns? Well, to understand a little bit of what you might need to defeat this man, we need to backtrack just a little bit again. Not to the Royal Rumble 2023, but 1 year prior, the Royal Rumble 2022. A famously disappointing event, by the way. I covered it. The event peaked in the first match, which was for Roman's Universal title. He did not have both belts at the time. He was challenged by an old familiar face, that of Seth Rollins. To understand a little bit of this, we must backtrack yet again. You see, in the build to this match, which was somewhat abbreviated, Rollins showed up unannounced to declare himself the next challenger for Roman, and then spent a few weeks trying to get into Roman's head. Because at this point, Seth Rollins could not compete physically with Roman. He needed an edge. And mind games have worked historically. Certainly they work in professional wrestling. Why not try that? The history between Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins is fairly long. In fact, to fully understand it, we need to go back several years to 3 men. Roman Reigns, the aforementioned Seth Rollins, and Jon Moxley, then going by Dean Ambrose. These 3 men debuted as a faction, a trio known as the Shield. A group that has gone down in WWE lore for their dominance, and more importantly, perhaps for their influence. You see, these 3 men, Roman, Rollins, and Moxley, have gone on to, in some very real ways, define the face of North American professional wrestling for the last 10 years or so, for better and for worse. They were a somewhat unique trio. They captured the attention and of the fans. They had some truly spectacular matches. Unfortunately, like all groups, disillusion was inevitable. Nothing lasts forever. And this group fell apart after claiming an important victory. The very next night, it seems, Seth Rollins took his opportunity to separate himself from his brothers with violence, because violence is the language of professional wrestling. Violence is the means by which all matters of morality are settled. And he separated himself, and this group dissolved, to only be reformed briefly prior to Moxley's exit from the promotion, and even then, more as a nostalgia trip than anything else. But what happens to all of these gentlemen post Shield breakup is somewhat the interesting part here. Rollins aligns himself with Triple H and the Authority, which was a an interminably long-running angle that became so tedious and mind-numbingly dull and repetitive that it drove a significant portion of the WWE's fan base away. This would be one of the times when I, in fact, took a break from the WWE. In point of fact, it pushed a non-trivial number of people towards some budding competition. We will return to them later. But Rollins became a main event staple for that period of time. He was the crown jewel of the Authority for as long as that interminable angle lasted. Jon Moxley became a bit more unhinged, which is saying something. He was a little bit deranged already. Both gentlemen got new gear, got new sound, theme music, and went on to, again, define elements of the main event scene. Moxley's booking being a little bit dubious. In fact, his frustrations with the creative area of the WWE leading him to leaving and joining the then upstart All Elite Wrestling and becoming one of the fixtures of that particular promotion to great success. In fact, in 2022, as a variety of backstage mismanagement issues and egos collided to undermine AEW, Moxley became the hero that that particular promotion needed, but certainly did not deserve in many respects. But the history there between Roman and Rollins set the stage for some of this. There were a few further meetings between the two of them, but they seemed to, ironically enough, lack a degree of heat. Here, Seth Rollins attempted to get inside the head of Roman Reigns, pointing out that Roman had never beaten him when it really mattered. And being generally obnoxious, Rollins is a very naturally hateable individual. Roman, however, laughed this off, frequently reminding us that Rollins wants to talk about the past, whereas Roman doesn't care. He's not interested in the past. He's in God mode, as he said it himself. That's all that matters. And as he goes to leave a particular confrontation with Rollins, dismissing him as simply another in a long line of failed challengers, somewhat beneath his notice, worthy of only acknowledgement that he exists as far as Roman is going to defeat him, and then move on. Rollins brings up that he broke up the Shield. And this gets a reaction from Roman. It's an interesting reaction, and it is unfortunately not the winning narrative gambit that Seth Rollins thinks it is. See, when their match comes around, Roman comes out first, champion's prerogative. He did the same for Sami Zayn, in fact, and in that instance it was more to soak up the heat from the Montreal crowd and then allow Sami Zayn a godlike reception from his hometown. Here it's for the reaction. Because Seth Rollins does not come out to his old to his new music. He's not come out in his new gear. He comes out to the Shield soundtrack through the crowd wearing his old Shield gear. You see, after Seth brought up that he broke up the Shield, the reaction from Roman was interesting. Early in his run, one of the interactions between Roman Reigns and Jey Uso was an emotional, tearful almost Jey Uso screaming at his family, "I hate you. I hate you for what you've done. I hate you for what you're doing. And I hate you for all the years of you being like this," indicating that this might have been part of Roman all along. Roman is unfazed by this. In his calm, cool, manipulative demeanor, he looks at his cousin and says, "It's okay. I love you." He is sincere to the degree that a psychopath can be sincere about these things. He does in fact care about Jey, inasmuch as Jey serves his interests. And we get a mirror of that here, where the unflappable Roman Reigns, a man whose merchandise iconography draws heavily from Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather, very deliberately, looks at his former brother-in-arms, a very obnoxious, deliberately so individual, and with more emotion than we've seen from him anytime absent his brief spurts of unbridled rage, looks at Seth Rollins and says, "I hate you." Rollins delivers his annoying laugh, overplayed, and says, "But I love you," very clearly drawing inspiration from the Joker, various iterations of that character for his mannerisms. Rollins has misread the situation, and it becomes very clear once this match gets going. Rollins in his old gear believes that there is some affection here, that what Roman hates about him is that he broke up the Shield, that he took from him a brotherhood, and by playing on this shared history, he will gain an edge. He is wrong. And it becomes clearer as we draw to the end of the match. Roman has gained firm control of things. It's been a bit back and forth. It's a good but not great match. And as Seth lies on the canvas, not yet fully defeated, but beaten and very nearly there, he laughs again and offers a fist for the old Shield salute to his former brother-in-arms and says, "I still love you." Roman reacts badly, puts him in a guillotine choke, and renders him unconscious. However, Rollins is able to drag himself to the ropes. Roman refuses to break the hold. This results in a disqualification loss for Roman, but he retains the championship. This is the only singles match blemish on Roman's career since his return, to this day. The only other time he was on the losing end of anything was a tag team match where Sami Zayn was pinned. And here, as he holds the choke, the referee imploring him, "Let go. Let it go. Let go. Please, you're going to kill him." As a choke will do. A real one, at least. Roman screams back at the referee, "He won't let me." And this is more telling than you might think. Here's where Seth's gambit miscalculated. Roman does in fact hate him for what he did, but it wasn't breaking up the Shield. Not in the same way you might think. What happens after the match becomes a bit more cathartic when you understand what's actually going on here. Who is the he Roman is referencing? You might think it's Seth Rollins. Rollins is in fact the one who brought up their shared history, but it's not. Rollins has been content to simply wheedle away at Roman Reigns to try and find a chink in his armor, and while he found a chink, he did not exploit it properly. Now, Rollins lies face down, being choked unconscious by a madman. A brutal brutal man who is going to exact his pound of flesh for what Seth Rollins did to him. What exactly did Seth Rollins do? It's not just Seth Rollins that we have to understand here. We have to go back, again, to the breakup of the Shield, to what happened after. I referenced a bit already. Rollins got new music, became the centerpiece of the main storyline going on. Jon Moxley became something of a rival for him, an unhinged maniac with, again, ups and downs throughout his booking, and eventually leaves. But both men definitively move on from the Shield in appearance, in personality, in theme music, in all of it. There is history, but they have moved on. Well, what about the subject of our examination at the moment? What about Roman Reigns? Roman Reigns does not move on. Roman Reigns spends the next few years, despite being pushed towards the top of the card, using the Shield music, wearing the same gear, not really allowed to move on. And Seth Rollins has nothing to do with that. We, in fact, have to look for a moment here at another character, another player on the stage. We have to consider Vincent Kennedy McMahon, the owner of the WWE. To understand a little bit of what's going on here with Roman as he screams like a madman, he won't let me let go, he won't let me move on, we have to look at Vince. Vince McMahon is a creature of habit until forced into change. He's a man of singular vision in many respects. We have to go back a little bit to understand this pattern to the rise of the then WWF, the World Wrestling Federation. And Vince, in his wisdom, knew he needed a centerpiece, a figure, someone to rally around for his promotion. And he found it, the character of Hulk Hogan, a larger-than-life cartoon figure molded out of human flesh, a man of intensity, of promos that inspired, of great physical feats of strength, and a mastery of crowd psychology that remains virtually unrivaled to this day. And Vince McMahon built his grand empire, this part of it, the beginning of it, formed the foundation around Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan eventually had to move on. No one does this forever. He wanted to explore other options. And Vince needed a new centerpiece. Vince did not look for something new. He looked for something that could replicate Hulk Hogan. And he tried with a handful of people. Be they Lex Luger, the Ultimate Warrior. These are people cast very much in the mold of Hulk Hogan, and none of them really worked because, well, none of them were Hulk Hogan. And the times had changed. The clock is always ticking, as they say. People weren't quite reacting to Hulk Hogan the way they had in the past, and eventually, circumstances forced Vince McMahon to change his perspective, to go a slightly different way, if you will. From wrestlers leaving his promotion for his rival, WCW, to a steroid scandal that meant he had to reconsider the type of presentation he wanted, the type of people he put forward. Well, he dealt with that both PR and legal nightmare. He tried with other wrestlers to varying degrees of success, but he would not really find real success until he is forced again in a slightly different direction. Vince's vision for professional wrestling was very much rooted in sort of the early to mid 80s aesthetic and appeal. And as things changed into the 90s, well, I shouldn't have to explain too much of the cultural differences between the 80s and 90s here. Vince was forced to go a different direction creatively with the entire company, and it led to him stumbling into one of the most lucrative things he's ever found, that being not only the character of Stone Cold Steve Austin, but his on screen feud with Vince himself. Due to some injuries to Austin and whatnot, this did not quite go on as long as maybe other people might have hoped. There's, of course, a heel turn in there because no one can be the same character forever. But this was Vince's new cash cow, and ever since Austin retired, Vince has basically been trying to recreate, in some form or another, Hulk Hogan and the acronymity between an anti-hero babyface and an authority figure heel. Austin was somewhat of a perfect embodiment of that period of the 90s. He was crude, he was in your face, he was unrepentant, and he was not afraid to get physical. Vince McMahon was everything that people tended to dislike. He was successful, he was the boss, he was an egomaniac, and cheering on Stone Cold to beat up Vince McMahon on a regular basis was a somewhat formative experience for a great number of people, especially teenagers, in the late 90s and early 2000s. More the late 90s. Mid to late 90s. And Vince has been trying to recreate that or recreate Hulk Hogan pretty much ever since. Because Vince does not like different unless he has to. In the wake of Stone Cold retiring due to health concerns, there were other people in and around the main event scene that could believably somewhat carry the load, but when Vince tried to recreate his larger than life monster character, be that good guy or bad guy, in the form of Brock Lesnar, it didn't wind up working. Not that Brock wasn't a tremendously gifted athlete, he was. Not that he isn't a very good professional wrestler, he is. But Brock's temperament seemed to run afoul of the grind of professional wrestling, and for a variety of reasons, he left. This put the company in a pretty serious bind, actually. He was the one that they had been looking to build around. Again, another performer in the vein of the larger than life 80s. Brock Lesnar being a large man with freakish strength, insane athleticism, especially for a man his size, and a man whose presence demands your attention, even if he's not exactly the best public speaker in the world. But in the wake of Brock's departure, Vince needed a new figurehead. He needed a new centerpiece around which to build. And one man stepped up in the back. A man who, not too long before this, was so unbearably bland and vanilla as to be rendered almost invisible. And yes, this is a deliberate pun, because it's John Cena, who was saved from termination after being a painfully generic wrestler by exploring a little bit of his personality. The early rise of Cena is very clearly an attempt at somewhat mimicking Stone Cold. Very different. Cena's not a redneck. He's from Massachusetts. Cena is not much for skulls or country music or metal. He's more infused with hip hop and has a more distinct, somewhat urban feel to him. But his rise was being an anti-hero. A little bit of a heel at first. His work with Eddie Guerrero was very formative in that respect, but his rise was largely based around being antagonistic to both the SmackDown general manager Paul Heyman and the then WWE champion John Bradshaw Layfield, whose reign atop the Blue brand was something of a blight on those of us watching at the time, with intermittent bits of genuine entertainment splashed about. But it was tedious. John's rise there is very Stone Cold-esque, and it's not hard to see the parallels. Then, after he claims the title from the hated JBL, he moves brands, because the brand split was a thing at the time, and his time as the centerpiece of Raw begins one of the more fascinating long-term bits of professional wrestling reality. Cena is very much cheered at the beginning, but the crowd begins turning on him, and he spends the next several years of his career being maligned, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, but he is always John Cena. He becomes more of a Hulk Hogan style character. He wears brightly colored clothing, he sells mountains of merchandise, he gives inspirational messages about never giving up, which he means, by the way. This entire thing would not have worked. I mean, it still backfired a little bit on John Cena, but it would have fallen completely flat on its face if Cena's messages about inspiration and perseverance were not coming from such a genuine place. Cena became the centerpiece of the entire company. He had his foils, but he was the man. He was the merchandise mover. He was the ambassador. He was the man is granted more wishes for the Make-A-Wish Foundation than anyone else by a country mile. And he did this again in the vein of Hulk Hogan, but with his own natural charm, his own comedic timing, and all the things that make John Cena a unique individual. Well, Cena, despite a long run with the company, most of it spent near the top, eventually has to move on as well. Injuries, other opportunities, as everyone does eventually. And in the wake of Cena's near departure, Vince again needs a new centerpiece. And he turns to Roman Reigns. Now, understanding a little bit about what's going on here, you might think, why Roman? Well, Roman was very popular as part of the Shield. And everyone who had ever worked with Roman in a backstage capacity had nothing but glowing things to say about him. Vince saw this as well. If people as diverse of perspective and opinion as Jim Cornette, Dusty Rhodes, and Vince McMahon all arrive at the same conclusion about how valuable and how much upper bound limit there exists in a singular performer, they're probably onto something. However, remember about Vince. He does not like to change. He likes to try and recreate. And here we arrive at what Roman was yelling about. He won't let me move on. Roman's first promo after the breakup of the Shield is the stuff of infamy. He comes face to face with Seth Rollins, the man who, not too long ago, smashed him in the back with a steel chair, broke up the faction, left him lying, and left him adrift. He should be full of fire. And instead, what this poor man was sent out there to do was deliver an alliterative series of S beginning words, ending with, and I kid you not, you can find this if you don't believe me, suffer and succotash. Now, if you understand what's going on here, you can understand a little bit how this happened. Vince is trying to recreate John Cena, the charming Superman. And that's not Rome. If you imagine for a moment, if you look up this entire promo, imagine it coming from John Cena. It's still not great. But Cena had a natural ability and affinity for comedy that allowed him to, through timing, personality, inflection, elevate some very crappy material to being genuinely funny. Is it really any wonder when you look back on this that now that John Cena has the opportunity to work with talented writers, he's become a very successful actor in the comedic adjacent spaces? He makes WWE's writing work. You know how hard that is? Well, Roman knows. They sent him out there to die because Vince wanted to recreate John Cena. And Roman Reigns is not John Cena. Roman spent the next several years with Vince trying to make him John Cena. He spent the next several years with the same music and the same ring attire and the same promo style and the same presentation. This poor man was put into the main event of WrestleMania against Brock Lesnar. It went not well. Then Seth Rollins swooped in. And again, this is another thing that Rollins tried to levy against him was I beat you to win the title at WrestleMania in the heist of the century. Roman somewhat dismissed that claim, which maybe should have been a cue to Rollins that this was not the winning strategy, narratively speaking and tactically, that he thought it was, to simply reference their shared history. The two had a rematch at WrestleMania in New Orleans, Roman and Brock, that was so bad the crowd serenaded it for more than half of its duration with "This is awful" chants, bouncing beach balls through the crowd. And despite Roman being one of the rare instances of blood being shed in the current WWE landscape and wearing a crimson mask that was visually striking, the crowd hated everything about this. They did not want Roman. He had been shoved down everyone's throats in a manner that was doubly galling because it was not suited to Roman's abilities. If I might quote Brian Zane of Wrestling with Regret, the crowd got what they wanted, meaning Brock Lesnar retaining, and they were still pissed. Brock was so disgusted with how the whole thing went, as soon as he got back to the gorilla position, that position right behind the entrance curtain, he threw the title belt at Vince McMahon and stormed off, according to legend. There's enough people that support that claim that I believe it. Roman was never allowed to grow. He was never allowed to change. And everyone and their dog saw the potential within him, but Vince's stubborn insistence on Roman being a new version of John Cena in all the trappings of his Shield regalia, despite that having been dead and gone for quite some time, it was a recipe for disaster. And this is what Roman is yelling about. Not just Seth Rollins bringing up their shared history. He's yelling at all of it. And not just the disillusionment of the Shield. It's not the loss of brotherhood that annoyed Roman when Seth brought it up. It was not Roman going, "Those were good times and you took them away from me." No, 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 no. There's a look in his eyes, if you find that moment. It is a pained look. It is a haunted look. It is the look of a man who is reliving, even briefly, something terrible. Roman, when he says, "wrapped chair around my back," is not thinking about that moment. He's thinking about the years that came after. He's thinking about that moment as the genesis of the worst period of his life creatively, of all this adversity, of all this pushback. This man was standing next to The Rock when he won the Royal Rumble, and they were both soundly booed out of the building. That's something at that period of time, mind you. This is what Seth Rollins did. Seth Rollins put him in a position where Vince McMahon spent years wasting his time and sending him out there night after night after night after night to put on a fake smile in a fake persona, trying to recreate something that he is not and never has been. When Roman yells, "He won't let me move on," he is not yelling at Seth Rollins. He is yelling squarely at Vince McMahon for all the pushback and the abuse and the false starts and just the metric tons of crap that he had to wade through to finally become what he was always supposed to be. Roman had re-debuted not long before I began covering SmackDown on a weekly basis. And I remember very early into my tenure doing this, which is still ongoing by the way, we all had a collective moment, like the entire wrestling fandom, where we all kind of looked at each other and threw up our hands and went, "Where has this been?" This was inside Roman, this fascinating character. And you sent him out there with suffer and succotash. night after night after night after night. That's what he is screaming about. And in the aftermath of that match, he proceeds to take out years of frustration on Seth Rollins. He wears him out with a steel chair. He recreates the moment that Seth broke the Shield apart and stagnated Roman's professional life for half a decade, it seems like. And then he could leave. He takes a deep breath and finally is able to move on. Then he turns around and beats up Seth Rollins some more because Rollins took from him, and one does not take from the tribal chief. This is why Roman made the choice that he did in Hell. As he sat there, realizing that he was about to crush his family member, as another one desperately begs with him to stop, to find another way, to not go down this path, this is what Roman is thinking. He could stop. He could say, I quit. There is nothing stopping him. He might save his soul. He is not too far gone at this point. He could have saved himself. Saved, again, that modicum of humanity. But he won't. And he won't because there is cost. You start traveling down this path. I'm fascinated by villainy. In fact, I used to host a podcast all dedicated to it. When you start down that path, you can turn back. But depending how far down you've gone, there are consequences that you cannot avoid. In Roman's case, he can quit. He can lose this match. He can salvage his soul. He can reunite with his family. He can figure out all of this. But what is the cost? It's not just the Universal title. It is that, by the way, that is on the line, and Jay will become the Universal Champion. Roman will be going backwards. It took a return of leukemia and then time off to avoid a global pandemic to refresh Roman's presentation to the point where he could become something other than what Vince McMahon had been trying to make him. You may not know this, or you might. The last time Roman Reigns was pinned in a match was against Baron Corbin, then going by King Corbin, in a match that took place so long ago that the tag team FTR, going by the Revival in WWE, factored into the finish. Not too long into that feud, actually, Roman Reigns was handcuffed to the ring post and covered in dog food. This is a thing that happened, by the way. I'm not making this up. Roman now sits in the midst of hell, having finally started to push past all that. And it's costing him his soul. It's costing him so much that he may not even realize. And his cousin implores him, stop. Stop. Save yourself. Don't do this. And he sits, head in his hands, tears in his eyes, going, I don't even know who I am anymore. The man who spent years trying to be John Cena, whether he wanted it or not. This is a man who for years was told by a great many people with great insight that there is great potential within him. But his identity has been lost. And he is sacrificing parts of himself in the pursuit of this dream, in the pursuit of realizing this, in the pursuit of moving beyond years of crap. And this is costing him. And this is the last gasp of the Roman we knew, of the man we might have known, the good man that exists within him. Because if he quits, The tribal chief is dead. There is no wise man Paul Heyman at his side anymore. There is no budding island of relevancy. There will be no bloodline. There will be no record-setting title reign. There will be no main events of WrestleMania that are heralded and looked forward to. There will be none of this truly fascinating character that stands astride the world of professional wrestling. There will be none of the money associated with that. There will be none of the prestige. There will be it will go, it will go. It will evaporate through his fingers if he quits. And he will go back to being the big dog. The man covered in dog food. The man booed out of the biggest event of the year as a crowd is so utterly apathetic they're more interested in inflatable balls than a man bleeding buckets and screaming trying to overcome a monster in the ring. And he will not go back. He makes his choice then. And it is the same choice he has been making ever since. He will not go back. The chink in Roman's armor that Seth Rollins began to see was not fondness for the Shield, was not even anger at the loss of the Shield, that brotherhood. It was everything that came after. And Rollins couldn't exploit that. How could he? When he tried to bring up the past, Roman dismissed it. And Rollins tried to switch tactics to an emotional appeal. Unfortunately, he failed to recognize that the emotion being touched upon still dealt with the past, but not in the way he thought. This is ultimately what you need to defeat Roman Reigns. You need the past. Sami Zayn didn't have it. He might have had some interactions and he might have had crowd support, but as the animated version of Mulan tells us, no matter how the wind may howl, the mountain cannot bow to it. The island of relevancy is not swayed by the occasional brief typhoon that might roll over it, brought upon by fan sentiment. It is not swayed by these things. You need a bullet. You need that narrative bullet. And in this case, perhaps the best narrative bullet you could levy at Roman Reigns is, in fact, the past. But not in the way you might think. And this, everyone, is where our other principal player enters the stage. Cody Rhodes. Cody Rhodes had spent the majority, he's the son of the American Dream Dusty Rhodes, a figure of such legendary stature in professional wrestling. I'm not entirely sure where I would even begin to discuss him. Not only a brilliant performer with an unparalleled ability to get over with any crowd, but a man whose mind for the business has enriched hundreds of performers and wrestlers that have learned from him. The Shield, all three of them, were pet projects of Dusty's. In fact, there were a handful of wrestlers in addition to those three that were referred to when they were together in the WWE's developmental system as Dusty's kids. And, well, Dusty, of course, has biological children as well. There's Dustin Rhodes, intermittently known as Gold Dust, or Black Rain, or the natural Dustin Rhodes, throughout many different gimmicks across many different promotions, currently going strong in AEW and looking quite good for a man his age. And Cody Rhodes, who came up, who he arrived at the public consciousness actually at Dusty Rhodes' induction into the WWE Hall of Fame. Cody and Dustin both were present to induct their father. They are half-brothers, different mothers. And Cody's eloquence and comfortability with the mic, even in that brief little spate of time, caught the attention of a lot of people. And he had a good athletic background in amateur wrestling, among other things, and tried his hand at professional wrestling. He spent most of his early time in the WWE, in their developmental system, or once he was called up to the main roster. Cody's journey is a bit of an odd one. There's a degree of potential within him, but similar to Roman, he bounces around between a few similar to Roman in that he has to deal with some less than ideal circumstances, but he bounces around between gimmicks a bit more. Whereas Roman was forced into a singular vision of the next John Cena, Cody bounced. He started as simply the son of Dusty Rhodes. He became dashing, he became undashing. He grew a mustache, which actually got over. For those of you who might recall, there was a Cody's mustache chant at one period of time. He is given a somewhat ludicrous gimmick. To pair with Dustin Rhodes' Gold Dust, he becomes Stardust. And I forgot to mention briefly, he also becomes part of the Legacy stable, teaming with Ted DiBiase Jr. and somewhat being mentored and flanking Randy Orton as a group of essentially nepotists. And none of this really sits well with Cody. There's a brief interaction between Cody earlier in his career and Roman Reigns. Roman is one half of the tag team champions. This is still during the Shield days with Seth Rollins. And they are the enforcers of the authority. Again, that angle went on for a long time. It overstayed its welcome by a number of years. That's how long it went. But there's a title match between the defending champions and Cody Rhodes and Dustin Rhodes. I believe it's still using Gold Dust at this point. And this is a surprisingly emotional match, believe it or not. The Authority has been demeaning Dusty. They've been running roughshod over things. And Cody and Dustin uniting his brothers to take down part of the Shield and claim tag team gold. It's a surprisingly well-told story. It's a somewhat abbreviated one, but it's well told for as long as it goes. After a bit of time as Stardust, Cody leaves the WWE. He does a tour of the independent scene. He comes to Ring of Honor for a bit. He hangs out in New Japan. It is during this time, as he is starting to gain an appreciation for himself and figure things out, that the late Larry Zonka started referring to him as Cody 2 stars, because he was good for a 2.5-star match reliably. One of Larry's other complaints was, when Cody comes to town, he brings the circus. He brought a very sports entertainment infused presentation to a lot of the independent scene that leaned very heavily into a more grounded approach, and to varying degrees of success. But along the way, Cody somewhat famously responds to a tweet by Dave Meltzer, who does not believe that anyone could draw legitimate numbers outside of the WWE. Well, Cody puts on a bet with him that he can do so, that he and a couple of brothers, the Young Bucks, Nick and Matt Jackson — incidentally, you should change your moniker at this point, fellas, you are no longer young — that they could put on a well-attended, successful independent professional wrestling show. And they do. Cody and the Young Bucks and a gentleman by the name of Kenny Omega kind of formulated a new idea. And once they received backing by the money, in this case, Tony Khan, son of the owner of the Jacksonville Jaguars, they would go on to form the only real rival to WWE at the moment, All Elite Wrestling. And there's a real argument about how much of a rival they are, but they're certainly a viable alternative, let's say. And Cody is one of the centerpieces of this. But there's some decisions made in the back, and there's some presentation issues, and Cody winds up leaving after a few years. AEW is up and running, there's a lot of talent there, and Cody leaves. It seemed inevitable that Cody would return to WWE. He is too big a star in the world of professional wrestling. He's become, again, a notable persona. He's too big to simply go elsewhere. There is no real elsewhere to go. I mean, he could wrestle in other places. Again, there's New Japan. but there's not really a major competitor. He would be taking a step down, in some cases a notable one, to wrestle at certain other locations. He does in fact return to WWE, returning at WrestleMania last year, beating Seth Rollins cleanly. In fact, Seth Seth Rollins plays an interesting role in this when you consider, for just a moment, Cody Rhodes has beaten Seth Rollins 3 times. He is undefeated against him. In fact, again, he defeated him to win. He was one half of the tag team that was defeated by Cody and Dustin. Cody Rhodes has a better win-loss record against Seth Rollins than Roman Reigns does. But Cody returns and makes it known immediately his goal is to become WWE Champion, an accolade that eluded his father. This is put on temporary hiatus when he feuds with Seth Rollins for a little bit. And prior to the blow-off of their feud, a Hell in a Cell match, Cody tears his pectoral muscle pretty badly. He wrestles anyway, because he's a madman. And he defeats Seth Rollins inside Hell in a Cell, but then is on the shelf. He has to get surgery, he has to rehab, and he returns at the 2023 Royal Rumble, and he wins. He is the only real option to challenge Roman. And as he and Roman have begun interacting, it becomes clear that he is the only man to defeat him. And that's because of their relationships, respectively, to the past. Listen to the interactions between Roman and Cody. Roman assumes Cody's relationship with his past because there are some very interesting parallels. Cody was pushed in AEW as Cody Rhodes. Good, bad, or otherwise. And the crowd reacted intermittently, well or negatively. In fact, by the time he left there, he was a more divisive figure. His leaving was, in many respects, the right thing to do. He was pushed in some not as the champion and focal point of AEW, but always as a singular important player. And the crowd had begun to turn on him, similar to how they spent years turning on white meat babyface Roman Reigns. Roman is aware of this. He's not a stupid man. And if someone were to poke at Roman in the same way that Roman is poking at Cody, they would be successful. This, however, is a false assumption from Roman. Listen to the way they interact. Roman brings up, briefly, his history with Dusty. And he tries to poke at Cody, saying something to the effect of, I spent a lot of time with your father. And I'm not going to insult him or denigrate his memory here, not for cheap heat, because there's too much love in my heart for that man. He saw everything. He saw what's happening now. Keyword now. This is Roman's obsession, the now, more so even than the future. It's the now, and it is avoiding the past. And he brings up that Dusty never talked about Cody when they were together, again, attempting to wheedle at him with his past with his father. Cody acknowledges this is, something of an effective tactic, but brings up that this is motivation. That he now needs to win because Dusty's real son cannot fall to one of Dusty's fabled children. He needs to win. This is motivating him, not dissuading him. A few weeks ago, Roman brought up a lot of Cody's history, again, in an attempt to bother him, to get him off his game. He says, didn't want to do the Stardust thing here, so you ran away. Not an unfair description. You founded a promotion and a company that you couldn't get over in, and you ran away. Again, if you look at the end of Cody's time in AEW, not exactly unfair, though not an accurate representation of his total run there. Roman is still a heel, after all, trying to manipulate things. And then, once you got here, you finally got over, and your body quit on you. Pectoral muscle, all true statements. Roman Reigns does not need to lie. Lying is beneath him. He simply needs to tell the truth as it suits him. is what he's always done, at least in this current iteration, and it's always worked. But Cody acknowledges the truth of what Roman says. He is not rattled by this. He is motivated by it. And in fact, he brings up something that rattles Roman in response. That when Roman loses, for the first time truly loses, in well over 2 years, everything that Roman has built will change. Everything that Roman has built will crumble. When Roman is no longer the man, Jey Uso, who has been abused, manipulated by Roman, who was forced into being by his side via violence to his brother, who fell in line partially for his own reasons, but who returned recently out of fear for his brother's safety once again. See, I forgot to mention this, but in that beatdown of Sami Zayn, Jey Uso does not participate. Sami tries to make the same plea to Jey that has been made to others. Jey, you don't have to go down with the ship. Jey, stop. Jey, turn back. You can save your soul. Jey's in the middle of a history-setting run with his brother as tag team champions. They've entered themselves into the pantheon of all-time great tag teams in the history of professional wrestling. Jey has been the right-hand man of the tribal chief. Jey has been given everything that Roman promised him. But Jey also, more than anyone, knows the cost. Jey joined up because he was trying to save his brother. Jey has been on the wrong end of Roman's manipulation and abuse for the entire duration of their association. And Jey was going to leave. Roman got him back into the fold, Jey does return to the fold, by stating publicly that if Jey does not return, he is going to blame Jimmy for failing to get him back. Sami and Jey have had some interactions recently where Jey says, I have no choice. Sami doesn't understand this. Because he responds as you might if you think that Jey is rationalizing with no, you always have a choice. You choose to take Roman's abuse, and you choose to be his lapdog. And Jey, seeing in himself some of what he does wish he could be in Sami, wishing that he might have been able to save his own soul earlier to throw off Roman's oppression, but also knowing that Sami's not understanding. Jey will not allow harm to come to his brother. And if that means he gives up a little more of his soul, if he gets to attack someone he didn't really like all that much to begin with in Sami, someone who in a very real way did turn his back on the family and all that was offered to him, well, that's just icing on the cake, isn't it? Nice little bonus. But Cody brings up to Roman that when he loses, Jey's going to leave. Without the same presence and power and force of violence, that's all Roman has over Jey. Jey will leave. And Jimmy will follow Jey. They are twins. They are joined at the hip in many respects. And this will leave Roman basically alone. Solo Sikoa, the recently called up member of the family, he'll leave because Roman won't have anything left to require enforcing. And Paul Heyman, who was the first one that when Roman re-debuted, it was alongside Paul Heyman, who has been his wise man, his confidant, his special counsel. If Roman loses, then Paul Heyman will leave him. What does this leave Roman? Alone. But he put it very eloquently. Will be chief without a tribe. Last time Roman found himself chief with no tribe, Roman with no reign, what happened? After the Shield broke up, there's those years and years of mismanagement, of mishandling, of fan abuse, of start and stop, all of it coalescing. And Cody expertly threatens him with the past becoming his future. Because the future exists for Roman, but it's somewhat nebulous. He is more about the now. And the future becomes now, but it's less about long-term future and more about the moment. Because his past is nothing to be happy about. So he seeks to dissuade it. He seeks to ameliorate the pain with his ironclad grip on the present. And Cody, again, very deftly, threatened that. Threatened Roman with a return to what he used to be. And it affects him visibly. Cody Rhodes is the man to dethrone Roman because Roman's kryptonite is Cody's strength. Roman hates his past. It scares him. He is so scared by it and hates it so much that he devotes everything he has to making you forget it. Not by trying to erase it in some Orwellian sense, but by being so good, so dominant, so overbearing, so domineering, so good at his current role, and his current role will go on for so long, in his mind, that whenever in the history books people talk about Roman Reigns, they think of this. They think of the tribal chief. They think of the undisputed WWE Universal Heavyweight Champion, the Samoan Godfather, the leader of the bloodline, the man who elevated everything around him and at the same time crushed his opposition. He wants this to be the only thing you ever think of when you think of Roman Reigns. But his past is there. And it is the one bullet he can never avoid. It is his kryptonite. Contrast this with Cody Rhodes, whose history is perhaps every bit as up and down and frustrating and annoying as that of Roman Reigns. From wacky gimmicks to start and stop pushes to starting his own promotion and inevitably winding up in a position where he is disliked. In Roman's mind, this is all the ammunition he needs to unbalance, unsettle, and provide all the edge he needs to beat Cody Rhodes. Cody is not afraid of his past. It is not his kryptonite. It is his strength. Cody draws his strength from his past. The experience as being a goofy character, they gave him perspective. The time spent injured actually worked to his favor. The founding of AEW, when Roman brought that up, Cody immediately said, everything I did made sure that everyone in the back gets paid more, so I don't regret that at all. Nothing in Cody's past is a weapon. Nothing in Cody's past weakens him. It is his source of strength as much as anything else. And ultimately, this is what you need to defeat Roman. Roman assembled his bloodline through manipulation and violence. Cody assembled his support system by mending bridges between Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens. He facilitated them coming back together. He did not threaten them. They patched things up and chose to reunite to attack the Bloodline. And ultimately, Cody Rhodes is the narrative foil for Roman Reigns. I don't mean to dismiss Sami Zayn here, because Sami plays an important role. There's a truism of history. No great empire is ever conquered from without till it crumbles from within. Roman's empire crumbled from within, courtesy of Sami Zayn. Sami Zayn started those cracks. Sami Zayn reminded Jey Uso that he might be able to choose differently. And now Jey is resentful of the circumstance he finds himself in. Jey is not fighting for the same reasons and with the same fury. Jimmy Uso and Jimmy Uso are going to lose their tag team titles at WrestleMania to Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens. In no small part because of what Sami has done to erode the foundation of the bloodline. But Sami already got his reward. It's not the tag team titles. It's his soul. The fact that he gets to claim those with his best friend after coming back together again. I'm sure they will fight again in the future. It is inevitable between those two. But his rewards are not the belts. It's saving himself and reuniting with his best friend and brother in arms. The belts are secondary. For Cody, however, the belts are not secondary. The night after his re-debut for the WWE, Cody Rhodes put up a picture on the big screen of his father holding aloft the WWF Championship, which he had not won. He had defeated the then champion via countout, but the title does not change hands on a countout. Cody is here to fulfill that dream. The belts and the position atop the company are in fact Cody's reward for everything he has done. For all the years up and down the roads, for all the obstacles, and more importantly, for taking the right lessons from them. For standing across the ring from a god of professional wrestling. Roman Reigns is a monster. He has crafted himself a run at the top of this company that will deservedly go down in history. But narratively, he has done it on the back of fear, manipulation, violence, and a desperate attempt to move on from and convince you that from his past. He needs to move on from it, and he desperately hopes that you'll forget it exists. Cody's past is his strength. And his journey back culminates with him dethroning the Dragon. Roman sits atop the world of professional wrestling, but his foundation is crumbling. And the one man fueled by his one weakness is coming for those titles. Everyone, we are witnessing, again, a moment in professional wrestling that comes along so very, very rarely. Please enjoy it. Now, because I'm me, you know I might be about to leave you with something slightly more ominous. Again, I'm recording this before WrestleMania. All signs point to Cody Rhodes winning, and I expect him to. My slightly ominous warning to all of you has nothing to do with Roman might retain. He might, and that might actually spawn a riot. It's time for him to lose. Not just narratively, but he himself is ready to take some time off, pursue a few other opportunities, etc. His run has been legendary to this point in time, and he deserves a bit of a reprieve. But we have to consider Cody Rhodes for just a second or two, and this is going to be the slightly ominous note that I might leave you all with. You see, earlier in this program, I invoked a specific character, Griffith, from Berserk. Now, those of you who've read Berserk, what I'm about to say might, again, give you some pause here. But when I mention that Cody Rhodes right now is a wonderful narrative inversion of who Roman Reigns is. But there are some parallels between Cody Rhodes and the character of Griffith that I need to address very briefly. Both men have fair hair. Cody has returned from exile to stop a dominant empire from continuing to crush everything else underfoot. He has gathered to him powerful allies, and in a very real way, at WrestleMania, he looks to remake the world, certainly the landscape of WWE. Now, again, to fellow strugglers out there, he has Dream tattooed across his chest, obviously an homage to his father, but, well, if you see the parallel I'm drawing, you see it. And for crying out loud, his theme song is My Kingdom. Again, if you're familiar with the story, you know. Because pretty much every hero winds up a villain at some point, especially in the world of professional wrestling. On that note, thank you all very, very much for listening. This has been a new style of program I decided to try out because I was simply inspired by what was going on here. Thank you again for listening. I hope you enjoy this. If you would like to hear more stuff like this, please leave feedback. Always appreciated. Until next time, on whatever show I happen to see you on down the road, stay safe out there. Continue to be well, be safe, behave.